Hi everyone, it's Lindsay Adreon from Crafting While Caffeinated here with you guys on Splitcoaststampers today to share with you a video tutorial on shadow stamping. For this technique, you will need a stamp set, 2 dye inks, a darker and a lighter dye ink, and some cardstock. And that's all you're going to need, and you can use any variation of colors you might want. So I am stamping today on a piece of fun foam just to get a little bit better stamping, and I am going to be using a black ink and a gray ink. Now I'm going to be using this stamp set. It's called Blessed and it is from Inspired by Stamping, but I have a piece of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch gray cardstock. Now the first thing I want to do is stamp this word blessed in my black ink. Now I am using my fun foam behind my panel here just to get a really nice and good stamp each time I stamp. Now this stamp in particular has a little tail on the front and on the back, so I am just going to connect those and make a background paper essentially here with this word stamp. Now I do want to remind you that I am using 2 dye inks here to do my stamping with. Now you don't necessarily have to use dye inks, but I would highly suggest it. Your pigment inks tend to layer and your dye inks tend to blend. So you really want the blendability with these inks that they provide to you. So just be aware of that whenever you go to pick out your inks that you want to use for your stamping. Also, I am showing you a complete background in the majority of these samples where I use this technique. You don't have to use it for a complete background. You can always use it individually for one stamp or one image that you might be using, whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be a complete background like I'm doing here. One last thing I do want to say also is that you really do want to use your clear stamps for this. You can by all means do this with a stamp positioner and your red rubber stamps. You can also probably get by with the woodblock stamp, but you get more control with your clear stamps, so I would just suggest using your clear stamps for this. Now once I had my background completely stamped, I went ahead and cleaned off my stamp pretty well here, and now I'm going to flip over my fun foam here so I don't get any black ink on my stamp, and I'm going to switch over to my gray ink. So I'll ink up my stamp, and then I'm going to look straight through the stamp. You can see my head right there. I'm going to look straight through that stamp, line it up, and then shift it up and to the left a little bit and stamp it down so I get a nice shadow effect. Now you can do this to the right and down. You can do it to the right and up. Whatever way you want your light source to be, just make sure if you're doing a background like this, you continue with that same shadow or light source through the entire project. You don't want to do one to the bottom right and one to the top left. It's just not going to look right. So make sure you continue using that same light source. So I'm going to give you a nice close-up so you can see a better look at that shadow you get with that nice gray ink. Now on each row, whenever I do this background, I only need to line it up one time. Then I can continue to just connect those little tails with my gray ink, and I know since I connected all the other tails on my black words that it's going to go ahead and match up each time. So I only need to line it up once on each row. Now if you do this where they're not connected, you will need to line it up each time, but that's why I suggest using a clear stamp so you can just look straight through it, line it up, shift it, and stamp it down very easily. If you did want to do this technique with your red rubber and a wood block stamp, I would just suggest using a stamp positioner like your Stamp-A-Majig or something similar to that, just to make sure that you get a nice shadow effect and that is similar each and every time you stamp it. You don't want one that's a 1/2 inch from the stamp and one that's maybe an 1/8 inch. You just want it to be pretty cohesive looking. So there's a nice close-up of that finished shadow stamping technique, and there's a finished look at the card after I put it all together. Essentially, I just stamped "May All Your Days Be" on a white banner, put a few other banners down, added a few sequins and a bow, put it all on top of an A2 card base, and I was finished with that card. I let the shadow stamping shine through on that one. Now I want to show you a different variation of this. Just by using a different panel and a few different colors, you can get an entirely different look. So I'm going to be using this scalloped stitched rectangle die. It's from Craft and Desert Divas. I'm also going to use this Thanks sentiment stamp, and this is from the Simply Said stamp set, also from Craft and Desert Divas. This is just a tiny word sentiment, and I'm going to use it to fill up my entire background. Now I have masked off all those edges so they're going to stay nice and clean, and I'm starting on the bottom edge of the paper, and I'm chopping off a little bit of that stamp so I get a true pattern paper look with this stamping. Now whenever I go up to my next line, I'm just going to go ahead and shift that over and stamp right in between the two words on the bottom row so it doesn't look so symmetrical. For this stamping, I am using the Terracotta Tile ink from Paper Tray Ink, and this is a darker orange ink, almost a burnt red. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to stamp out this thanks word and fill up this entire panel to make a nice background. Now once I have that entire background filled up with that word stamp, I'm going to move on to Orange Zest ink from Paper Tray Ink, and this is a little bit lighter and a little bit brighter color of orange, and this is going to be my shadow ink. So again, I am moving mine to the left and up just a little bit, and then I'll go ahead and stamp it down. Again, I'm using clear stamps for this because it's very easy to see through, and I can line it up. Now on this stamping, I do need to line it up each time and shift it over each time because they're not connected in any way. Whereas on the other one, the tail ends were connected, so I could just easily connect them on my gray ink stamping. However, on this one, I will need to line it up each separate time. But again, it doesn't take too awfully long, and I think the end result is worth it. Again, I am keeping my light source coming from the bottom left hand or the bottom right hand corner. So my shadow is to the top and the left, if that makes sense. And I will continue stamping with that same light source in mind and the same shadow for each individual stamped image. Now once I have all of that second layer of stamping done, I'm going to go ahead and remove this painter's tape that I had sealing off my edges and keeping them nice and protected. And then I'll give you a nice close-up of that finished shadow stamping with these orange inks. There you can see that I have a very nice shadow effect. Now for this card, I just went ahead and applied that scalloped rectangle die to an A2 blue card base, went ahead and used the Your Possum stamp set and colored up a little scallop circle, applied that right on top, and that finished off my card. Alright, I have a few more samples for you. Now on this one, I'm going to actually be using a pattern stamping. So I'm going to be using this lines, background basic lines is what it's called. It's from Inspired by Stamping, and I am going to make a plaid pattern with this. It's one of my favorite things to do with this stamp set, and I just like making plaid patterns to fill up backgrounds. I can stamp a sentiment and my card is good to go. Now for this, I'm actually going to add shadows to this plaid pattern. So I'm starting off with this Rosebud ink from Memento. It's a hot pink ink, and I'm just going to start out making my plaid pattern. Now I have a 4 by 5 1/4 inch white cardstock panel here that I'm stamping on, and again I'm using that fun foam behind my stamping just so I get a nice clean stamping whenever I do it the first time. Now to start off my plaid pattern, I like to start off in a corner. So I'm starting off in the bottom right hand corner, and I've just made a little X with my lines. Now I'm going to bring in this Angel Pink ink. Again, this is from Memento, and it's just a lighter pink than the Rosebud. Now I'll look straight through that stamp, line it up, and then shift it to the right of that line just a little bit and stamp that down. And this is going to give a nice shadow effect from that lined image. Now I will continue stamping this. If you wanted to do this plaid pattern a different way, you could always stamp the plaid pattern and then come back in and put all your shadows in. I just added shadows as I was stamping just because it's kind of a hassle to change out these larger line stamps on my acrylic blocks. Now on this one, I shifted it to the left just a little bit, and there you can see I've got a nice shadow on those pink lines with that lighter pink ink. Now I'm going to move to this smaller solid line, and I'll stamp it on both the left and right side of each of those hot pink lines. This is a dark blue ink, It's called Paris Dusk, and I am just again going to stamp those to the right. So I've cleaned off that stamp really well, and I'm moving to this lighter blue now. And this ink is called Summer Sky. Now again, I'm going to be using that same shadow that I used on the lines beforehand. So on these that are on both sides of the line I'm stamping on now, I'm going to make the shadows just a little bit to the left. And then for these top lines, I'm going to make them to the right a little bit. So I'll go ahead and stamp this final light blue line, and then I'll give you a nice close-up and you can see how well this pattern is starting to come together. Now, I like to use two different colors of ink for some of my plaid patterns, so I'm going to go back to that rosebud ink, and I'm going to stamp this medium 4-line stamp. Now, I'm going to stamp this again on the left and right side of those blue lines on both sides, and then I'll come back in with that lighter angel pink ink and add in the shadows on those lines as well, making sure that I use the same shadows that I used beforehand. Now those skinnier lines were a little bit more difficult to place, but if you ever feel like you didn't get a deep enough shadow, just go back and restamp. Because they're clear stamps, you can do a couple restampings very easily just by looking straight through your stamps. To finish off this card, I matted that plaid pattern background onto a scalloped navy blue rectangle die cut. I stamped thank you with that same blue ink that I used beforehand on a white oval die cut and matted that onto a hot pink die cut and stacked all of that onto a top folding A2 card base. On all of my other shadows, I have used a variation of the darker ink. So on my pinks, I've used a lighter pink. On my blues, I've used a lighter blue, and so forth. On this particular shadow, I'm going to use a different color entirely. So I'm starting out with this Aztec Background Builder stamp set from Joy Claire Stamps, and I'm using this first line of stamps, and I'm stamping it with a darker turquoise ink. On the left-hand side there, you can see all the colors of ink I'm going to use for this pattern. So I've used that dark turquoise, I'll use Simply Chartreuse from Paper Tray Ink, and also that terracotta tile that I used beforehand from Paper Tray Ink. Now all of these inks have a brown undertone, so I have pulled out Desert Sand from Memento, and this is a brown, very light brown ink, almost a khaki color, and that's going to be my shadow. So I've pulled from those undertones of the stamps for my shadows. Now I'm going to build up this background. On this particular background, it was very tempting for me to stamp that bottom little zigzag line. I wanted to pull that shadow down, but I needed to keep that shadow going the same way as that top zigzag line, so I had to shift it upwards. So this was one of those patterns where it was very tempting to go away from that starting light source, but just make sure that you continue with that light source throughout your entire card base. There you can see that final pattern with all the shadows behind those stamps. And to finish this card off, I just added a very dark orange circle die with a banner that says Get Well Soon that I used that same blue ink on. I added a few different sequins, and that finished off that card. And there's a nice close-up of that great shadow effect that you get with this technique. Now, if you did want to use your stamp positioner like your Misty for this technique, you can absolutely do that. It will be helpful if you're doing a lot of different stamps at one time, so you can get them all exactly the same shadow. So here I just have a 3.5 inch by 3.5 inch white top folding note card here that I've made myself, and I'm just going to put this in my stamp positioner. Now I went ahead and made sure that it was unfolded for easier stamping. I'm lining that bottom portion, which will be the bottom portion of the card base, up against the top of my Misty. And then I'm also using that grid mat behind me to really help me get placement right. So I'm putting it right up against the end of a square. And now I'm just going to go ahead and place my sentiment stamp right in the center of that card base. Then on top of this, I'm going to put the little letter I, and then right below that, I'm also going to put you. So the sentiment will essentially read, I love you. And since I'll be using the same inks with all of these, I'm going to go ahead and stamp them all at once. I can line all of these up and stamp them all at the same time. So I'll close my lid, pick up all of those stamps, and then I'll be using some black dye ink to go ahead and ink these up with, and then I'll just stamp that right down. Now because I am using my stamp positioner, I can go ahead and double stamp these and make sure they're nice and dark. Now what I want to do is I actually want to move my card base. So I'm going to take those little magnets off, move it to the right slightly, and also down just a little bit, and that's going to give me my shadow. Now again, I'm using that grid mat behind my paper to go ahead and help me line this up and just shift it slightly. Now I went ahead and I've cleaned off those sentiments. I've left them all just as they were when I stamped them the first time. I haven't moved them at all. Now I'm going to ink them up with some gray ink. Then I can just close my lid, stamp it down, and just go ahead and peek through that window, and you can adjust your paper as needed before you stamp down then. And there I've got a nice shadow all ready to go for my sentiment. Now again, I'm using my Misty, so I can double stamp this, and it's going to be perfectly aligned with that shadow. Now I'm going to go ahead and add some hearts around this sentiment. And this is another little fun thing you can do here. So I went ahead and stamped those hearts with some red dye ink, and I didn't have a lighter red dye ink, and I really didn't want to use a pink. So what I did was I'm going to go ahead and shift my paper. Again, I'm shifting it to the right and down using that same shadow that I've used on my sentiment. And then I'm going to go ahead and ink up my stamp with that same red dye ink that I used on the hearts. Now what I can do, since I don't have another lighter red that I want to use here, I'm going to go ahead and put a scrap piece of paper down first, stamp it down, and that will get half of the ink off, and then I'll go ahead and use second generation stamping to apply my shadow. So if you don't have two different colors of ink, you can by all means do second generation stamping and still get the same great shadow effect. So there are just a few more variations of the same technique using a few different tools, and also how to get more out of your inks with this technique as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this video tutorial, and I can't wait to see what creative ways you all use this technique. As always, thank you guys so much for watching.